So I really only want to talk about four things today. At a high level, I want to do a slide on a recap of the business. I want to talk about the concept of the breeding supply chain, because I think as a more recent life, I sold wood, and I was in the log production end of the business, and that supply chain is extremely well defined, particularly in larger organisations. And as I came into the breeding company, I found just getting the order of the various elements that make up the breeding supply chain, getting that sorted in my mind took a little while, and then we finally managed to crystallise that in a little diagram that I just want to share with you today. And it will just help, I think, with some of the concepts that I want to touch on. I want to deal with 4 slides on myths and folklore. This is pretty basic stuff that we're going to be going back to at this point, but I've got a captive audience for 20 minutes, and I want to get back and deal with some very fundamental misnomers about the business. I understand 1 or 2 of those may have come up yesterday, so I'm sorry that I wasn't here to address those. I think Russell fielded some of those questions on RPBC's behalf. But we can talk also a bit more about that under the Q&A at the end. And then I'll talk briefly about the aspirations of the business. Not being a breeder or geneticist, I've stripped my presentation of jargon, bar the one word germplasm, and you can read the definitions, the technical definitions. If you don't get to the end in the next few seconds, really I'm just talking about, when I talk about germplasm, I'm talking about bits of plant. Think about pollen, seed, bits of tissue, okay? Just bits of plant, but I'll use the word germplasm a lot in the next 20 minutes. So RPBC, what does it look like? It came out of the old cooperative in 2002. It was established as a not-for-profit enterprise. It's still a not-for-profit enterprise. Has 15 shareholders, making up almost 2/3 of the national estate in New Zealand and about 1/3 of the national estate in Australia. 21% of the shareholding is now directly affiliated through its own affiliates to the STBA. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So the STBA, for people who don't understand the acronym, is the Southern Tree Breeding Association. So essentially our equivalent organisation in Australia. Revenues for the business are derived via levies, and those are shareholder levies, not the forest growers levy that you're probably more attuned to here. But when I talk about levies, I'm talking about shareholder levies or non-shareholder royalties. Our annual budget's around $2 million a year. And historically, we've been a joint public-private partnership. Most recently, that's been our relationship with MB, and prior to that, its various precursors and predecessors. Probably, if I was to highlight one of those bullets, it would be the third one. That might surprise some people. So, who makes up those organisations? It's people like Hancock. It's people like New Forests, who operate in 2 quite different estates in Australia, and they're now taking a holding in an asset in the south of the South Island. 141 have entered with their purchase of Nelson Forest as well. So whether you like it or not, the Australians are coming, and we've spent some time really over the last 6 months in particular working out how we work more closely and collaboratively with the STBA. We both run very small programs. We both essentially do the same thing. We do it slightly differently, but by and large we do the same thing for the same purpose. And the boards that operate, these aren't small enterprises that span the Tasman in this 21%. They're all 100,000 plus estates. Is Mike Baker, you here? How big's Hancock, Australasia wide, including, you've got to be 500,000 or 600,000, right? So you're talking heavyweight boards that are starting to think about how enterprises like ours work together with their peers in the industry. Okay, they carry a lot of clout. The mission, the board sat down as it sort of came out of a period that I call the Troubles, early last year. Sat down around the middle of the last year, of 2017, around August, and started to think about its place in life. And Regardless of what you think about the merit of missions in this particular one, I actually think they did a pretty good job, to their credit. So the key words in this statement are really that elite, we really only want to be dealing with the very best germplasm, whatever traits of interest that we're chasing. We really only want to be dealing with the top end. That's where the big money is. Knowledge, support and tools. So there's no point breeding without building the bridge to deployment. I think I'd be the first to acknowledge that I don't think we've done a very, very good job of that at all. In terms of commercialisation, we are all about profitability. Again, breeding for breeding's sake is pointless. There has to be value, and there has to be value to you and the people who deploy. We're about Radiata. We're not about other species, and I don't see in our mid-term future that I don't see us moving into other species. We're a specialist pine breeder. So I want to come onto this concept of the breeding supply chain. At the left-hand end of this, you've got the various research activities. You've got funding, the various providers, then you've got some outputs, and they eventually, in terms of Radiata breeding, have to funnel in through the RPBC's breeding population. So you've got many funders, many providers, and lots of outputs funneling in through the single breeding population. That population is bred and then put up to the market with some agreed terms to people who are signed off and authorised to bulk that germplasm up. Okay, so we call those the germplasm producers. So there's one organisation managing the breeding population. We've got 4 germplasm producers in the country. Come back to those in a minute. There's about 10 to a dozen commercial forest growing nurseries, and then there's several thousands, about 14,000 growers in New Zealand alone. So that supply chain looks a lot like an asymmetric hourglass, and the pinch point is us, is our organisation. And I think with that comes a lot of responsibility to not just occupy a space, but to be seen as as open and inclusive and collaborative as we possibly can. And we probably haven't made such a good job of that, if we were really honest with ourselves, over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. We lost our way a little bit. So you've got one breeder, the 4 germplasm producers. 2 of them are in the clonal space, so we're talking about Arbogen and forest genetics. At least one of those is represented here today. And then we've got the 2 conventional seed producers, probably more familiar to most of you, Olsen's and Proceed. Okay. The nursery growers, I tend to think of them as merely toll growers, and that's their skill is taking contracted seed and growing on a toll basis, and the demand pool really has to come from the people at the far end of that supply chain, the growers. If there's too many boxes there for you, I would just think about it as 2 broad ends to a spectrum. There's research going on at the left-hand end, there's deployment going on at the right-hand end. Don't confuse deployment with the doing bit. Having been around the space now for a year, there's a hell of a lot of doing going on at the left-hand end, far more than I would have really appreciated until I came into the space and got close to the research end. Okay, there's a lot of doing going on in there. So deployment's really about uptake from research, intelligence, learnings that have been developed at this left-hand end. Let's bust some myths. So this is pretty base stuff for the next 4 slides. Russell and I have had several conversations over the last few months, and he'll hit me with sort of a left field question, which about RPBC's role and its place and stage in life. And I say to him, do you really believe that? Where does that come from? And he said, well, I get asked these questions by my members. And I thought, well, what I do today is just take some of the most common ones that I've heard over the last 6 months and just deal with them in this forum on his behalf. And hopefully we can put some of this stuff to bed. So this is my favourite. Why does RPBC keep all the best germplasm for itself. And I want you to step back one slide to the breeding supply chain. The answer to this is it doesn't. It's a breeder, and the idea of breeding for itself without deployment is just an anathema. So the RPBC puts its germplasm up to the market interface with the germplasm producers and lets them take it from there. So our role is simply to continuously develop and improve the breeding population, okay? But your shareholders get preferential access to bulked up germplasm. So that's kind of that's a related question in a way, and a very strong view that are held by some people. And I go back to this point that while our shareholders are inside the RPBC, they're working collectively and collaboratively for the benefit of the business, funding it, supporting it, driving it forward. As soon as you step beyond breeding and into germplasm production, those shareholders all go their separate ways. They're all competing with each other in the supply chain for bulked up germplasm, just like anybody else is. They don't get preferential access to anything. What they do, and this was articulated really well to me by one of the GPs a couple of months ago. He said it's just like germplasm production is just like any business. You've got commercial drivers, just like anybody else has. You've got a board to satisfy and shareholders to satisfy, but primarily your relationships with your customers drive your business. Your relationships with your customers drive your business. And those customers who turn up and buy more at higher margins on a more regular basis will probably get a slightly different level of service than someone who turns up once every 20 or 30 years. And I think that's not an unreasonable expectation for someone running a business, and I think you shouldn't think that's an unreasonable expectation as a customer. If you're a big customer, you have a certain level of pull and scale and desirability about you that a one-off enterprise doesn't. It's just the market. It's the way it works, okay? So in terms of RPBC's shareholders, the difference in scale between the smallest and the largest grower is a factor of almost 20, and I would suggest that that grower at the smaller end of the spectrum gets serviced quite differently than the grower at the larger end of the spectrum by germplasm producers. Access to breeding values would be a life-changing event for me. For some reason, breeding values seem to have assumed a level of expectation similar to sort of winning the genetic version of Lotto, and it's just not the case. And probably the thing that bears this out most strongly for me is the fact that even within the shareholding, most of my grower shareholders don't wait for the breeding values each year, they wait for the subsequent GF Plus report. And the reasons for that, GF Plus has almost been, it's one of the strongest brands, I think, sitting in the sector at the moment, but it's almost been too effective in its uptake. And I would dearly love the shareholders to be making more use of breeding values, but I think until I remove the crutch, that's going to be a problem for the business. So the board right now is sort of contemplating life with a single desk for description of genetic material, something quite different than is operated in the last 30 years of either the co-op or the company. We're working through that as we speak. Probably the thing I would say, if you really do think that way about breeding values, I would just say, just think about what's the answer to the question if I mail them to you tomorrow. You open an envelope and there's your breeding values. What are you going to do with them? What exactly are you going to do with them? Tease that through to its end point and see where you end up. It's quite a useful exercise. This was a hoary chestnut from, got this a couple of times earlier in the year. Why do you pay my royalty out as a dividend to your shareholders? We don't. We're a not-for-profit enterprise. We always have been, and we always will be, I think. There's a really important part of what we do is trying to operate on a least cost basis. We've probably pushed that too far in the last, particularly the last 5 years. We've probably been a little bit mean with how quick we are to come to the table and invest in this space and support the business. But I did find 3 or 4 years ago there'd been a purple patch in a particular season with the gathering of the royalty. I think we gathered an extra $30,000 or $40,000 in that season, and the business had taken the opportunity to reduce the call on shareholders that year by the equivalent amount to hit its budget and hold its budget neutral. And I can't actually imagine have I got any directors in the room? I got Barry. I can't imagine today's board taking that view. It's just counterintuitive to everything that we've talked about. So we're really about getting the money in, and we'll hold it until we've got valid research to get stuck into. Okay, why do those perceptions exist? This will be a presentation on its own, really. But if I just talk about, I think there's a whole range of issues on several sides of a table here, but if I just talk about RPBC, there's probably 3 things that have really contributed to this. One is that personalities, people and relationships have really got in the way of doing a lot of good work over the last sort of decade, and we haven't got on top of some of that quickly enough. There's been a massive loss of trust. Trust bridges have been burnt left, right and centre, with research providers in particular, and we're busy trying to restore some of that now, and that is progressing well. Probably the third reason is that the RPBC, because it occupies that little space in the supply chain that I talked about earlier, it's the only entity there. When the pressure went on, we tended to sort of be more of a tortoise. We just withdrew our legs and our head, went into our shell, and didn't engage. And it probably wasn't that useful, right? So those are the things that I just see from our side of the table. But I don't think RPBC, by any stretch of the imagination, is 100% culpable for the situation that we're managing ourselves out of today. And I think there's a lot of other people in the room that will have other views on whys and wherefores, and would probably happily put their hand up for some of those things, given the chance. But I'm not giving you the chance today. A few slides to go. Short-term aspirations. We're there now, actually, with this one. We're actually a fully self-funded business. We're turning over $2 million now. So we've come back from $3 million. Christmas this year, we're scheduled to finish our partnership with government funding after 30 years. Discussions underway to make sure that that doesn't occur. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that we could actually sustain the business on a self-funded way, and just get on with the job of collaborative research and managing the breeding population. And as of 1 July, we could do that. What does $2 million buy? It buys you, at the bottom of that bar, the breeding operations program, and at the top of it, it buys you some research. And it's split reasonably equitably on a dollar-for-dollar basis between those two things. The marginal dollar that comes into the business, it simply goes to research, genetics and breeding research, okay? We don't really need any more to run the breeding program in the orchards. How do we fund it? 3 ways. Almost half of it comes in from the shareholders, the 15 shareholders, so just under $1 million. We expect we'll generate around $500,000 from the GF Plus royalty. And if you want to do the maths and go back to percentage weightings of estate held by shareholders, non-shareholders, in one of my early slides, you'll find that those bottom 2 numbers, the 500k, the 900k, are basically a lock for each other. They're a direct relationship there. The bit that's out of step is the genomics levy, and this is the $5 million worth of research that's been funded by $2.5 million by MB and $2.5 million by the shareholders over the last 4.5 years. All the funding for that program will be in by Christmas of this year. The program will finish June 30, 2020. Yep. So, and that's a piece of work that, as we get into, we've We've done what I'd sort of consider loosely the blue sky element of that over the last 5 years. The next 18 months, there's a huge amount of expectation, isn't there, Heidi, about the rubber hitting the road for delivery and deployment. How do we take this and apply this for forests? But I can honestly say that as soon as that $600,000 program, we're locked into that ongoing too, by the way, we'll be spending about $500,000 a year on genomics going forward. It's once you're on that wheel, you don't really stop. You just keep going. But once we hit the deployment phase, I will absolutely be wanting to roll that investment back into the basic levy and a lift in the royalty. So I just flag that with anyone who thinks that they struggled with the 46% lift in the GF Plus royalty this year. There's more coming your way in about 24 months. We'll be talking. Okay. What does that give me?
3 minutes.
3. So the long-term aspiration, I just boil it down to very simple things because I'm basically quite a pragmatic sort of a person. Maximum gain, well-characterised germplasm. Well-characterised just means that we can describe it well as fast as we can and at least cost. Okay. How do we measure that success? This is John's going to talk to you about all sorts of things about realising gain and proof of gain in a couple of talks' time. But for me, I find it really hard to go past the MPI nursery survey. I always convert this to a mixed chart, so it's a percentage chart on the y-axis. Green bar, CP deployment. Orange bar is OP deployment, stand select down the bottom, making a comeback a few years ago, and no prizes for guessing what that blue line is going to do in 12 months and 24 months' time. But what has really intrigued me about this chart is the green line always seems to hit an asymptote at about the 70% mark, and it's not just sort of 1 year, it's been about 15 years we've been trying to push through there. And there are a whole range of issues, some of them about supply side, some of them are about demand side, but I think until we understand those things, we won't see 80%, we won't see 90%. And I think working those things out together, working collaboratively on the solutions on the supply, both the supply side and the demand side is vital. Acknowledgements, Russell, thanks. And Veronica for your help too in the last couple of weeks, but thanks for the opportunity to talk today. I think how long since we've talked here? Right. Okay. So I had this. Right. So I think I had the really inoffensive title of my talk was just when it came in the mail was just RPBC update, and I think Russell was just pleased that he got something. So anyway, so that's what you've got. I want to thank MB. If there's anyone from MB in the room, your support over the last X years is basically we can't do it really without without the support of public monies. The shareholders and the royalty payers are obviously in there, skin in the game, and the research partners, present and past. This is a long-term thing. I feel very much just like in forest ownership, there's an element of custodianship about this program. 16 years as a company, maybe 10, 12 years as a co-op, 14 years as a co-op, and then before that, invested heavily within FRI's structure. I mean, you're just continuing other people's good work, really, and we're really looking to get this thing back on track. Did I say anything in closing? I should thank the board too, because I think, Barry, are you the only one here? I think so. Barry's the only one that came. So I think the things that we were talking about 12 months ago, all we were talking about 12 months ago was about money and solvency and keeping the business afloat and going. And by January, we kind of had that sorted. By July this year, we were starting to really turn our mind to proper matters of governance, technical issues, relationships, and taking the business forward. And the board's got some really interesting stuff in front of it now, stuff that it hasn't really had to confront probably in its life. And I'm pretty confident they've got the right group of people there to see it through. So that's all I really want to say. Thanks for your time, and we can talk a bit more on the Q&A. Just have a conversation there if that suits you. Thanks.